Now, what we're doing is we are going over Bill Nye's book, Undeniable. Now, as I said in the prologue to this whole series, Undeniable is one of his books that he wrote as a response to the debate with Ken Ham at the Creation Museum. So what Bill Nye's doing is he's going through in this book and he's talking about evidences for evolution and why creationism is ridiculous. Okay? Now, a lot of these people who talk, they will say things like, we have no problem with religion, it's just, and then they'll proceed to bash religion. Because Christianity is so tied into the idea of creation, even the people who believe in old earth creation, or who believe that evolution could be a link or something that God uses, are still going to deny the principles that Ken Ham brings out. And let me explain this. According to evolutionary theory, what we see is undirected. Okay? It is undirected in the sense that there is no designer. Now, when you say that is undirected, they'll be like, well, of course it's directed. It's directed by natural processes. Okay, but is there something? Is there actually a force that is directing things? Because if there is not a force directing things, then it is by definition undirected. That makes sense? Okay, so yes, you could say natural selection is directing this, the force of nature, all of that. Okay, but there's not actually something that is saying we're going to pick this and we're not going to pick that. It is animals who have a trait that has arisen randomly, and they discover that this trait actually allows them to survive, and so that trait persists. Now, behind me, there's a book called Darwin Devolves, and on the shelf over here, you can't see it very well, is another one called, oh man, it just vanished behind Atlas Obscura, Darwin's Doubt. I was like, it's right here. Darwin's Doubt. These two books are going to deal with Cambrian explosion, and the other thing they're going to deal with is this idea that a lot of these traits that are really, really essential to life sometimes are buried and don't actually produce any beneficial results until they fully manifest. The illustration that's given in one of these books is this. Imagine you have a house, and the basement is flooding, and you've got a river that's just flowing right at your house. You have two options. You can wait for the parts to a pump to come together to pump the water out of your house, or you could just bust a hole in the wall, and the water will come through and it'll flow right back out. Which one in the short term is going to be the better solution? Breaking a hole in the wall and letting the river just flow through, and that way it doesn't build up and flood your whole house, or waiting for the parts to come together for a pump to pump the water out of your house. In the short term, breaking a hole in the wall of your house is the best option because you need it done fast. Long term, that's going to be a problem because now you have a big hole in your wall. But in the short term, that is the best short-term option. Okay? There are a lot of genetic traits that in the short term would be extremely beneficial, but in the long term are going to be a problem. And so the comparison is, a lot of the things that we see are like the parts to a pump coming together, and they're beneficial for the long term, but the organism had no idea that it was going to need all these parts. In fact, some of these parts would be absolutely useless unless they were together in a pump form. Okay, that is what Michael Behe is going to call irreducible complexity. He's going to use the illustration of a mousetrap. We can get into that later. But that is the illustration that we see in nature. There's a lot of times where, for whatever reason, animals are actually choosing things that are not beneficial in the short term but are beneficial in the long, and there's no reason for it. Now, obviously, we don't see the process of evolution now because it's such a short, compressed amount of time that we can't see new structures developing. But we do see where, this one organism will absorb another, and then they become symbiotic, and they can actually basically can't separate themselves anymore. Evolution 2.0 and a previous video if you want a discussion on that. And so we do see some really amazing things, but we can't see evolution happening in the grand scheme because we just don't have enough time to research it and see it happening. So as we deal with Bill Nye, the idea here of this undirected process, you are going to have plenty of old earth creationist types who are still going to have a problem with that. They may go along completely with evolution. They may go along completely with the evolutionary framework and the different ages and epochs and all of that. They can go along with all of that, but they're still going to say there was a designer. That is not where Ken Ham goes. Bill Nye. That's not where Bill Nye goes. Just so we're on the same page. Now, as we go through this book, I do want you to understand, Bill Nye does not have an understanding of creationism. He has a very surface level understanding, almost, I'm just going to call it a parody of creationism. It is a standard straw man argument. He is going to lift up arguments and he's going to say, that's ridiculous. And he's going to cast it down. And so let me read a little bit to you out of the book. He's talking about the importance of studying evolution. All right. And I'll read just a little bit here. He says, we are all so much alike. This is him saying, because we are all human. But it goes deeper than that. Every species you'll encounter on Earth is, near as we can tell, chemically the same inside. We are all descended from a common ancestor. We are shaped by the same forces and factors that influence every other living thing, and yet we emerged as something unique. Among the estimated 16 million species on Earth, we alone have the ability to comprehend the process that brought us here. Any way you reckon it, evolution is inspiring. Now, one of the big issues I have with Bill Nye, now, let me say something positive about the book. He reads the audiobook, and it is great. All right? I enjoy listening to Bill Nye. I enjoy, there's a lot of good evolutionary history. There's a lot of good evolutionary science in there. And so if you want to learn about evolution, read the book. Okay, go get the book and read it. Great. All right. I disagree with a lot of the book, but as far as the audiobook is concerned, for free, it was great. All right. But Bill Nye, he has a quirkiness to him. Again, he's a guy I grew up listening to. So I like the guy. He's a little kooky now. He's gotten into the idea where he's denying that there are two genders, if I remember correctly, and you can look up that stuff on your own. But as you get into this, one of the things that I have a problem with, other than the fact that he doesn't understand creation, is this idea that he thinks that if you deny evolution, you're denying the scientific progress that brought us all sorts of technology and physics, etc., etc. That's just not the same. Okay? I can deny this principle of biology that is evolution. I can deny that there is a undesigned process that creates all the life that we see, and I can still have respect for the process that brings us technology. That has absolutely nothing to do with my accepting of evolution. In fact, most scientists through the years actually did really, really great science specifically because they had a creationist type worldview. There were so many scientists through the years who thought because there is a structural design, there must be a purpose for these structures. And that's actually how we made a lot of the scientific discoveries we did. If you believe that there are things that are vestiges, that are left over from previous stages of evolution, then go ahead and remove them. There used to be lists of vestigial organs or organs that were left over from the process of evolution. They were useless organs, so just take them out. But then they started realizing things like the appendix and the spleen and tonsils and things like that. Oh, those actually are really important. And so as you go through, you have to understand to deny evolution, or at least the traditional views of evolution, is nowhere near the same as denying normal science. Okay, there have been great scientists. There will continually be great scientists on both sides. In fact, as you understand other sciences and you understand design principles and the fact that, you know what, you can't just add anything in there at random and expect it to work. If you have that understanding, it actually helps you appreciate the structures that are there and the precision that is there. Now, yes, there are some designs that to our understanding seem messy. But the fact might be that we just don't understand why they work that way yet. It might just be that there are things there that, like a 2-year-old looking at a circuit breaker going, I don't see why there needs to be all these wires, and just pulling. Okay, that's actually extremely dangerous and destructive. We are far more complicated than a circuit. And so if we look in our bodies and go, I can't understand why that's there, it could be us. You have to have the humility to say, there may be things I don't understand. Now, as you continue through, again, chapter 1 of his book, he says this: despite all of this, so evolution is inspiring. That's where he ended. Despite all of that, a great number of people in many parts of the world, even in well-educated parts of the developed world, are resistant or hostile to the idea of evolution, even in places like Pennsylvania and Kentucky here in the United States. The whole idea of evolution is overwhelming, confusing, frightening, and even threatening to many individuals. I can understand why. It's an enormous process unfolding over times that dwarf human lifespans, across billions of years and in every part of the world, and it's profoundly humbling. As I learn more about evolution, I realize that from nature's point of view, you and we ain't such a big deal. Humans are just another species on this planet trying to make a go at it, trying to pass on our genes into the future, just like chrysanthemums, muskrats, sea jellies, poison ivy, bumblebees. Many people who are troubled by evolution want to suppress teaching the whole concept of descent through natural selection in schools. Others try to push it aside or dilute it by casting doubt on the established science that supports it. State education standards allow the teaching of fictitious alternatives to evolution in Texas, Louisiana, and Tennessee. Even though the people who support these curricula live lives that are enriched in many ways by science and engineering, everything from running water and abundant food to television and the internet, they avoid the exploration of evolution because it reminds us that humanity may not be that special in nature's scheme. What happens to others also happens to us. And then he goes on to talk about smartphones and all of that. And therefore, if you deny evolution, you're denying smartphones. Okay? Let me point out a book to you. Now, you have seen this book in the Genesis Project before if you are a watcher of it. But Evolution 2.0 by Perry Marshall. He has a blog that he does as well and a podcast. He actually came to conclusions about design specifically because he understood technology. And because he understood with sound waves and things like that, you can't just have static introduced to the system. You can't have that interference and expect speakers to work properly. So you can't expect all of this chaos to be introduced to a genetic sequence and expect it to work properly. Let me put it this way. If you watch documentaries like Icons of Evolution, or if you read that book, the National Center for Science Education and other industries are actively trying to suppress teaching anything that could cast doubt on evolution. So on the whole, it's actually the other way around. When I taught creation in the Christian school that I used to teach at, there were parents who were upset at me for teaching evolution. Still did it. Because I needed them to understand what they were up against. There are plenty of people who teach creation and they teach evolution right alongside it so that you understand what the evolutionary points. As I did research, there were certain aspects of the curriculum that I left out because I didn't think they gave evolution the best point of view. What I mean is, I didn't think they accurately represented evolution, and so I didn't want to parody the evolutionary idea and basically build a straw man like Bill Nye does in this book. I wanted my students to have a rigorous understanding of this is what evolution teaches, this is what's at stake, and I wanted them to understand it. And yes, there are some creationists who are going to get upset at that. I say, so what? The fact is, when kids go out into the world, they're going to get exposed to evolution every which way. That doesn't mean it's true, it doesn't mean it's false. Evolutionists are actually more afraid of creationist stuff getting out than the other way around. Especially creationists who know what they're talking about, because creationists are ridiculed and they're mocked, and anyone who casts any doubt on evolution, even if they're not a creationist, even if they're just an intelligent designer, they are mocked, they are looked down upon, sometimes they are driven out of the system. Okay, you want two major illustrations if you want to go do this research on your own. Look up Icons of Evolution. I linked it in a previous video. I'll try to link it in the description. Icons of Evolution. Look it up. There's a documentary where a teacher was fired or basically drummed out of the system because he dared to present current scientific research that called doubt on the stuff that was in the curriculum. So they had things like Haeckel's embryo drawings, which we've already talked about in a previous discussion. Haeckel's embryo drawings have known to be fraudulent since the 1800s, but they are still in science textbooks because they're free. My grandpa, who is a genius of a guy, when we talked creation evolution, those are some of the illustrations he brought up. And at that time, they had already been debunked, but they still come up because they're sort of directionally true. So go look up Icons of Evolution, and I'm going to recommend you also to go look up Ben Stein. He put a video out years ago called Expelled. Check it out. Researchers and scientists who dared to question the dogma, and they're looked down on as idiots. So this idea of the creationists being the ones who are afraid, and the creationists being the ones who, oh, we're just afraid and we don't understand it. No, we understand it. We don't understand what we're missing because very smart people believe this stuff and we don't see how it's possible. Not how it's possible, like we don't think it's possible to even happen. But how do you even possibly believe it? Undirected complexity. We're talking complex systems with information that actually has meaning. And you think it happened by chance. So that's why as I go over this chapter and over these books, it's not comparable to rotating plants. It's not comparable to water pumping and electricity generation and all of that. All right? Again, he goes on, he says, I'll admit the discovery of evolution is humbling, but is also empowering. It transforms our relationship with the life around us. Instead of being outsiders watching the natural world go by, we are insiders. I'm going to pause right there. The Bible actually says we are stewards. We are to be caretakers. So this idea, if creationists have it, that we are to let the natural world go by and just go with... No, we are to be caretakers. We are there from the very beginning in the Garden of Eden, tending to the garden. We are right there, and the fate of the world is our fate as well. But the Bible gives us comfort in that it says, as long as the world endures, there will be seed time and harvest and all of this. Now, it talked about the end times, and the world's going to be very devastated. But if you are a Christian out there and a creationist, and you think what happens to this world doesn't matter to you, you are deluded. Of course it matters. He says, we are part of the process. We are an exquisite result of billions of years of natural research and development. What you will find with a lot of evolutionists is they will use sciencey stuff like, oh, research, development, design, selection. But who's doing that? What is doing that? Because like I said, as we go over this stuff, there are certain genetic traits which are not inherently helpful until they come to their full majesty. And then suddenly it's like, oh, that was really helpful. It's the idea of you got water flowing to your house. Are you going to break a hole in the wall to let the water flow through? Or are you going to wait for the parts to come together to build a pump? The lazy and the easiest way is to break a hole in the wall. But what we see is for some reason, things choose to wait sometimes to build a pump. Again, he goes on, he says, frankly, my concern is not so much for the deniers of evolution as it is for their kids. We cannot address the problems facing humankind today without science, both the body of scientific knowledge and, more important, the process. Science is the way in which we know nature and our place within it. And I would agree with him. This has impacts on our kids. Because if you teach your kids they're animals, and you teach the kids there are no absolute morals. Because, again, science can only deal with the natural world. When we talk about the supernatural and miracles and all of that stuff, that is, by definition, outside the realm of science. It is. It doesn't mean it's not true. It just means it is not detectable, measurable, or even interactable with science. And so as we talk about this idea of scientific knowledge and all of that stuff, yeah. But let me ask you, what experiments can you do to prove evolution? You can surmise, you can guess. He comes up with a few illustrations later in the book of like Tiktaalik and some of those things that they predicted. Oh, this would be found in a swamp, so let's go where there was a swamp. And they found it. And I go, so you expect to find a swamp-dwelling creature in a swamp, and you go to where there's a swamp and you find it. That's not unbelievably astounding. But okay. So what I want you to do as we go through these reviews, and there's a lot more to the chapter if you so desire, go get the book and read it. I want to ask you a question, and I want you to ask yourself the question as you read this book. Are the things that he says contradicting creation? Do they contradict the conclusions of creationists? Because as I read this book over and over and over again, there would be statements that he would make that I would look at and go, so what? Great. What does that have to do with anything? Like, it was a great story or it was a great explanation. But how does that deny creation? It's simply telling you how things work. How is that an evolutionary thing? If you're confused, go back to my previous episode on creation and evolution. In that video, you will find me explaining how a creationist will look at the world. We don't deny that things change. In fact, we believe it. Things change. That's evolution. We just don't believe they change from one creature into another. And even people who aren't creationists will admit that. You have intelligent design people who say, no matter what we do, bugs are still bugs, and dogs are still dogs, and cats are still cats. And there seems to be a threshold that they can't get out of. We don't get it. And so as you look at his book, I want you to ask that question. Are these things that actually deny creation? Now, as he goes on, it says this. He's talking about the history. Again, there's some good history here. It says the publication of On the Origin of Species in 1859 created a sensation that proved President Bell spectacularly wrong. There's just an illustration he gave earlier. It also made Darwin far more famous than Wallace, who was another guy who proposed evolution, as Darwin remains to this day. His ability to articulate the theory of evolution is still astounding. On the Origin of Species remains a remarkable and remarkably readable book, readily available in hardback, paperback, and online a century and a half later, and I have a copy in my office. In it, Darwin gives us an example after example of evolution and explains the means by which it happens, providing both the facts and the mechanism in one volume. And then he goes on to praise evolution, and great. The great questions of evolution bring out the best in us, our boundless curiosity, and our boundless ability to explore. After all, evolution made us who we are. And that's how he ends this chapter. But again, I ask you this question. If you believe there is a designer, if you believe there is a genius designer who put character traits inside of us, does that stop you from doing research? Does that stop you from going out into the world and doing tons of study? Because it definitely didn't stop the great researchers before Darwin. It didn't stop the great researchers who did work with plants and who discovered water circulation and blood circulation and all of that. They were driven by the idea that they thought there was a design. They thought there was a purpose. And so they wanted to go find it. And so as Bill Nye plays up this idea that evolution is giving us the desire to go explore, I actually think that it does harm. Here's why. If I am a product of random chance, there actually is a chance that some of the things we find are left over and don't matter. I'll give you one illustration and then we'll end today. He talks about the giraffe, and he says almost every animal you see, they have a nerve that will connect from their brain down into their heart, and then there's a nerve that will come up and connect into like their voice box. And he's like, you got this really long and it just doesn't make sense. And the fact is, if you chalk up all of those nerves to something as simple as, well, the thing we evolved from had it, so it was just left over. What drives you to go out and say, why on earth is this a common design of almost any animal you look at? Why does it have a nerve that goes way longer than it should and it loops back up around and does all this weird thing? Why is that a thing? And you know what? I don't know. But if you say, it's just what I evolved from, it's just left over. What is the desire to go out and explore and research? In fact, it would strike me that you're giving up and saying, it's just what I came from. But a creationist, someone who believes there was a design, is going to go into that saying, that seems really random. I wonder why. Guys, this has been a review of Chapter 1 of Bill Nye's book, Undeniable. And we'll continue this on Creation Week. And I hope you guys like the video. Like it, subscribe, comment below what you think. And if you have any questions for me, let me know. I've been studying and teaching this stuff for years, and so I'd love to give you the resources and even some links and things like that. And so guys, Thank you for joining me on the Janus Project today, and I will see you, Lord willing, tomorrow.